Over the course of its 8-season run, Psych rather quickly distinguished itself as a show with a great concern for the finer details. Whether that be in the show's many crimes and solutions, pop culture references, or just keeping running gags going strong for nearly a decade. Rather than the show focusing heavily on the premise of protagonist Shawn Spencer being a fake psychic, the way that shows like Dexter or Suits are predicated on hiding a secret at all costs, Psych instead chose to make the relationships among the principal cast the focal point of the series, with the issue of Shawn's fraud only occasionally rearing its ugly head. Probably the best example of this is how many episodes are framed by Shawn learning police skills from his father, or him and Gus getting up to some sort of mischief as children. Things that have nothing to do with psychics or their secrecy, but inform how the gang end up behaving later in life nonetheless. This focus on the characters and how they play off each other ultimately produced a slew of highly memorable episodes that stick with the viewer. Not just because of the criminal case the episode featured, but also the way in which they enriched both the world of Psych and its cast of lovable characters. To name a few, there was the Pierre Despereaux saga, a series of episodes with Shawn's adoration of a high-profile art thief conflicting with his duty to solve the case, much to the chagrin of those around him. There was Right Turn or Left for Dead, which showed Shawn solving the same crime in two separate sliding doors-esque realities. And finally, there was the episode Remake, aka Cloudy, with a Chance of Improvement. A self-aware reimagining of an episode from Season 1, seemingly for no reason, filled to the brim with former guest stars from the show. Equal parts swan song for the series in its final season, and hilariously meta joke that only Psych could have pulled off so elegantly. The relationships among the show's varied cast is an integral part of its momentum, and even its enduring appeal, as there was true care taken in making them seem genuine and fleshed out. Mainly by dedicating as much time as necessary for chemistry to naturally arise, never forcing romance or conflict even when they were clearly inevitable. For example, rather than ending the first season as a couple as they would have in any other show, Shawn and Juliet instead spend almost half the series in a state of will they, won't they uncertainty. Rather than Lassiter being a one-dimensional foil to Shawn like he easily could have, he instead has a growing respect for Shawn as a person, and even comes to accept his methods. And last but not least, the show could have easily continued Shawn and Henry's strained relationship for cheap friction, with Shawn doing nothing to enable his father's attempts to get close to him. But instead it leaned into repairing their relationship and resulted in some truly special moments. As its cast matured over the years, so too did the show, and that maturation made what could have been a stale and generic dynamic one of a sincere and evolving sense of camaraderie and family. With the show managing to finesse these kinds of intricate and complex relationships with a level of sophistication that makes it look almost effortless, it would be only natural to assume that when it came time for Shawn's true arch-nemesis to arise, an adversary whose only goal is to one-up and defeat Shawn, this character would also be handled with the same amount of care and produce the same amount of high-quality moments for the show. Sadly, this is not the case, and the villains the show ultimately provided were poorly executed, devoid of compelling motivation and just plain disappointing. And by going through the show's Yang saga, the emergence and eventual defeat of these very same villainous misfires, I aim to identify what went wrong, how it went wrong, and the way in which the franchise ultimately stuck the landing on this bizarre villain paradigm several years later. And just to be clear, for the purposes of this video, the Yang saga is made up by the following episodes. Season 3, Episode 16, An Evening with Mr. Yang. Season 4, Episode 16, Mr. Yin Presents. Season 5, Episode 16, Yang 3 in 2D, Psych the Musical, and last but not least, the final 30 minutes of Psych the Movie. So let's start at the start. An Evening with Mr. Yang comes totally out of left field when considering the rest of Psych as a show. Yes, there had been drama before, but for the most part it was self-contained and episodic, directly related to the case at hand. Here, things go from light and upbeat to utterly dire in a matter of minutes, a stark contrast to the show's previously comedic overtones. Beginning like any other episode, it sees Shawn and Gus simply getting some lunch, or breakfast, they can't really decide, but soon an infamous serial killer, Mr. Yang, re-emerges and nominates Shawn as his newest adversary. Throughout this episode, Shawn is forced to rise to the challenge of a deranged killer testing his mettle. The insufficiency of his carefree attitude is exposed not only to his colleagues, but even to himself. And the resulting tension makes for some heated interactions that are previously unexpected from this cast.
If that girl dies, you're an accessory to murder.
It's also the first time the stakes of a case have a direct impact on Shawn himself. When he ultimately refuses to play the killer's game, his own mother ends up getting kidnapped. After showcasing just how effective his powers of deduction actually are, even in a pinch, Yang simply surrenders to Shawn and decides not to blow up his mother, saying,
I need you to like me, because we're going to be working together again.
Hinting at plans to toy with Shawn again in the future. Throughout this episode, we have seen Shawn go head-to-head with a bona fide villain, and come out the other end well and truly saving the day. All in all, An Evening with Mr. Yang is a great episode of Psych, and if left alone, it would make for a rather compelling and memorable one-off case, arguably one of the best. The question of why Yang picked Shawn of all people to play with is certainly still present, but not particularly damning given the fact he spent the last 3 seasons developing a high profile both in the Force and the news. This episode managed to deftly balance the high-stakes nature of Shawn's predicament with the signature comedy the series is known for, in a way that respects them both and is ultimately cohesive. For every kidnapping or bomb threat, there was genuine humour to provide much-needed levity. Really, the episode's entire construction is a testament to the level of care and detail that permeate the rest of the show, and a worthy test of Shawn's skills. The Yang Saga's second installment, Mr. Yin Presents, is where the cracks start to form for this little arc. The tension, drama, and comedy are all still present from the previous episode, and the use of Mary Lightly as a red herring for the true killer's identity is appropriate given his behaviour, but the construction of the episode and the way in which Yin's identity is hidden seems clumsy at best and, dare I say, inept at worst. Despite the fact that once again Shawn's skills are put to the test, and the trap where he can only save either Juliet or Abigail is genuinely terrifying, the partial reveal of Yin is cartoonish and underwhelming to say the least. Spectacle seems to be the main idea behind this episode, rather than who Yin is and what his end goal is. The Hitchcock references and motif are certainly visually striking, but other than mildly feeding into Shawn's established love of film, they offer very little substance. Then there's Mary, who spent all of his on-screen time being ridiculed by Shawn and the gang, only to be killed by Yin in a misguided attempt to be the hero that caught him. The only problem is that this so-called heroic death is very abrupt, and it borrows visuals from Psycho that have aged to the point of comedy. So much so that a scene that should be legitimately somber and tender results in a messy and bizarrely final death for an otherwise light-hearted character. There's no build-up to this guest character making such an incredible sacrifice, and if it were a series mainstay it would have been gut-wrenching. But having the strange and entirely comedic Mary Lightly die a hero's death is just out of place. And this is no clearer than in the fact that his death isn't even mentioned until the montage at the end of the episode, and that at his funeral, rather than deliver some sort of heartfelt eulogy, Shawn and Gus are dressed up for racquetball, which is something Mary specifically said he had no interest in doing.
You didn't give racquetball a fair shake, did you?
I will not wear short pants, Shawn.
I think it's time for you to go home, Mary.
Yes.
Furthermore, there are several moments throughout the episode that clearly imply Yin has a connection to or obsession with Shawn, when he is shown stroking a picture of him with Yang. This is something that we know to be untrue when the killer says so himself in Yang 3 in 2D.
You've been obsessed with me since I was a kid.
No, Yang. Yang was obsessed with you, Shawn. Yang. I didn't even know who the hell you were until you started doing this shtick.
It's sloppy, and it sucks out any gravitas that their final confrontation should have had, feeling less like a final boss and more like yet another criminal. It suggests that the writing staff simply hadn't decided on Yin's identity yet, and rather than having him be someone with ties to Shawn or his family, instead he is plucked from the ether like Yang before him. This doesn't add to the mystery, it only hinders it. And that ultimately leads us into Yang 3 in 2D, the decisive ending to the series' inclusion of the Yin-Yang killers. Mr. Yin, when he is finally revealed, has almost all the elements of a great villain, especially within the context of the Psych universe's love of cliché and tropes. He dresses the part, he is equal parts imposing and fear-inducing, the fact that he is a genius, much like Shawn, marks a great parallel between them, and he also has a very dark sense of humour that accompanies his grandiose methodology, such as being cognizant of the fact that it's cliché for the villain to reveal their motives before killing the heroes, but doing it anyway. Without any backstory, Mr. Yin is the right amount of mysterious, clearly living a double life as a brilliant professor, but going to great lengths to continue his life of crime as well. The only thing missing is, sadly, a significant reason to have chosen Shawn as his adversary to begin with, which undermines all of the above. He makes it clear that Yang had selected Shawn due to her strange attraction to him, and he took aim later as a form of revenge against her. And not only is that a terribly flimsy reason to begin with, but it doesn't even really add up on paper. At no point is the viewer led to believe Mr. Yin is so easily swayed by his emotions. In fact, as he is dying, murdered by his own daughter, he merely offers a rather dispassionate,
I never loved you.
It's more than a little difficult to believe he would be emotionally driven to toy with Shawn, and it's once again in direct contrast to a previous scene in the saga. Remember, he doesn't care about either of these people. This has long since been the Achilles heel of this entire arc, and the fundamental problem with the villain Psych finally serves up. Of all people Shawn has run afoul of in his life, of all the mistakes he's made, and all the trouble he's caused, his true nemesis is the father of the woman who saw him when he was a kid? No matter how you slice it, that's just so incredibly unsatisfying. Given the fact that there have been so many installments in the Yang saga already, with many chances to do things right the first few times around, it is equal parts cathartic and frustrating that all of the problems of this little arc are finally addressed and remedied systematically in the final installment, Psych the movie. Firstly, Mary gets some well-needed redemption as he shares a slightly melancholic but earnest scene with Shawn, with the latter receiving maybe his first and only legitimate psychic vision in the entire series. Mary and Shawn share some small talk, but also Mary asks Shawn about his relationship with Juliet, and provides a cryptic hint about the film's true villain, all by singing Gin Blossom's Allison Road. Yes, this scene is caked in humour, it is still Psych, but there's an authenticity and friendship to their interaction here that was sorely lacking during Mary's lifetime. The fact that Shawn even dreamt of Mary, and how he spoke to him once he had, also speaks to a certain wistfulness and regret Shawn has about the latter's death, especially considering he appears alongside three of the most important people in Shawn's life. A nice, genuine touch. But more importantly, Psych the movie nails the weakest aspect of the Yang saga on this go-around, and that is of course the villain, and it does so by using the exact same formula from the series. Alison Cowley is an almost beat-for-beat rehash of Mr. Yin, following her former mentor's playbook to the letter. Have a lesser criminal be the outward face of your escapades, use them as a red herring and dispose of them once they've fulfilled their purpose, show an ability to be taken more seriously than your underlings, and have a flair for the dramatic as you decisively try to murder your enemy. It's just that in Alison's case, she has a clearly established vendetta against the entire cast. She was denied the chance to murder Shawn and Gus, and everyone else played a role in her being arrested years earlier. She was already shown to be unhinged, and the previous events of the show only compounded her believability as a legitimate villain with a grudge against Psych. It's incredibly simple, but the shared history between Shawn and Alison doesn't require any work on the viewer's part to care about their rivalry or understand each other's motives. It's all laid bare, free from the contrivances of Yang's attraction and Yin's half-baked revenge plot. She wants them dead, we know why. The Yang saga, as it appears in the television series, is clearly a victim of incomplete ideas making their way to the screen before they had fully developed. Otherwise, all the inconsistencies and contrivances would be non-existent, and a villain like Allison would have already emerged. It is a relief that Psych the movie not only presented a villain worthy of Shawn, but also tied it into the pre-existing villain's mythos, clearly being a beneficiary of a more careful approach without the serialized television deadlines. But it will always remain a shame that the excellent crime solving and the fallout of the Yang saga will continue to be marred by the lack of any real motivation on the part of the big bad killers. Perhaps, at its most charitable interpretation, the fact that Yin and Yang were just two random psychopaths who happen across Shawn's path is the show's writers saying something about the random, mundane nature of real life. A standing refutation to Shawn's ideals about what coincidences can mean.
But the fact that we are sitting here, here in this place, it has to mean something, doesn't it?
That Yang wasn't Shawn's clone, or someone he bullied in high school, or some other spectre from his past, may play into something that underpins the very premise of Psych, and something that the show is at great pains to point out. Shawn is a fake. There are no psychics, no ghosts, no Bigfoot, and there is nothing that can't be rationally explained that our heroes will ever come up against. Perhaps the relative anonymity of these two villains is instead just Shawn's life being average and mundane, no matter how hard he tries to live an extraordinary one. Or perhaps, as painful as it is to consider, this will forevermore remain an unfortunate blemish on Psych's outstanding back catalogue.